ice sheets. In Europe, there was so much money generated from long, stable climates that the excess wealth was put into building the great monasteries and cathedrals and universities, and it all suddenly came to an end in 1280 AD. We bounced out of a warm period called the medieval warming, where it was about 5 degrees warmer than now, and sea level wasn't higher, yet we had 400 years of warmth. We went into the Little Ice Age, and it was cold, and that was driven by the sun. And it was exceptionally cold when there was very little sunspot activity, when the sun was at a minimum. And we had some incredibly cold periods where rivers froze. The great Dutch masters painted the hoarfrosts. We had the ice fairs on the Thames River in London, the last of which were in the 1820s. Then it warmed up again. In 1850, it started to warm up. From 1860 to 1880, it warmed. Then it cooled from 1880 to 1910. Then it warmed from 1910 to 1940. In fact, the Northwest Passage was open at that period of time. Some German warships that went there, and many people could travel the Northwest Passage without special icebreakers. Then it started to cool from 1940 to 1976. And in 1976, we got a change in the way the Pacific Ocean works. That happens about every 70 years. And suddenly it got warm again and started to warm from 1976 to 1998 when we had big El Nino. And since then, it's been cooling. So just in the last 150 years, we've had 3 periods of warming, all of which are the same rate and the same amount, and 3 periods of cooling. Yet carbon dioxide has been going up. So if carbon dioxide is driving global warming, how come it's been cooling? How come it's cooling now, yet carbon dioxide is going up? So even in our own lifetime, there's a disconnect. So with climates, they are incredibly complicated. You cannot take out a trace gas from the atmosphere, and we humans are adding a very small amount of that trace gas to the atmosphere, about 3% of the trace gas we are adding. You can't take that out of a very complex system that involves what's happening in outer space, what's happening on the sun, what's happening with the Earth's orbit, and what's happening with the tides and volcanoes and continents moving around. You can't take that out and say climates are due just to one factor. It's far too complicated. None of the computer models predicted that we would have an El Nino in 1998. None of the computer models predicted we were going to have a cooling. All the computer models told us temperature was going to go up and carbon dioxide was going to go up. And the only time they were parallel was between 1976 and 1998. The rest of the time they haven't been parallel. And if we look back in history, every time you get a warming, anything from 800 to 1500 years later, you get an increase in carbon dioxide. So through my eyes, as someone who looks back in time to try to understand the present, there is absolutely no relationship between carbon dioxide driving climate. It's important to keep the planet warm. And the most important thing to remember about carbon dioxide is it is not a pollutant. Pollution kills you. And no one is arguing to put aerosols and chemicals in the atmosphere, the waterways and the soils. But carbon dioxide is plant food. The more you have, the more plants grow. And we see this in geological time. Every time we've been in a period when we have a lot of carbon dioxide, life has just exploded and taken off. And there's a very close relationship between life taking off and high carbon dioxide. In historical times, there's a very close relationship between great prosperity and warming. And in fact, in modern times, there's a relationship between the amount of energy you produce and how wealthy you are. So I argue that the current fad of human-induced global warming is a political movement that has very little to do with science, and has got all the hallmarks of a fundamentalist religious organisation, and that is that they accept no criticism, they demonise dissent, and those of us who can quite validly argue the science do not get a Guernsey. We really don't get a forum to speak on this matter, simply because it's a wonderful political movement. And if we said to our grandparents, one day a government is going to give us a tax on thin air, we would have got a clip over the ear. Well, that's exactly what's happening today. We are now facing a tax on air. So thank you for listening.